Welcome back to part 2 of 3 with the basket handle fire poker with Victoria Ritter.
So we're now going to get our other piece ready for the jump weld. We said we were going to put this on a long bar, so let's get that ready. I showed you the order of operations for making a scarf, and let's do that. We're going to take a 3/8 square bar, heated back no more than 3/4 of an inch to thicken this by upsetting it. So to get that short heat, that's the only time you can dip your piece down into your coal forge and get that nice short heat. Place the heated side on the anvil, and you're going to hit from up here to fatten that end up. Now, as you do that, it's going to bend. And if you don't immediately correct the bend, it's going to bend more. And we want a straight piece when you're done. So make sure that you straighten that as you upset it. It might take more than one heat. That's okay. Just keep that heat localized to that inch, 3/4 of an inch, and thicken it all the way around. I like to turn this every time I hit it, and I think that helps me keep a more even upset. And then once you're happy with the thickness, start angling the piece towards your hammer hand, in this case towards right-handed hammering, and start to put your taper on there. I told you I was going to tell you a couple ways to get that. Might as well just get that taper started right here. Now all you need to do is bring this side back to parent stock width, and then continue to narrow that toe so that you can get started on your scarf. If you don't want to upset it at the anvil, you can upset it at the vise, but you're going to need to think ahead as you hit this here to upset it, and it still should be a short heat. It's not as concerning because you're going to put it in this heat sink called the post vise, but a short heat is still warranted. You're going to hit here, and as you hit here, this is going to pull towards you. So start with it bent away, and then as you hit it, it'll straighten out, it'll upset, and then if you angle your hammer blows a bit, you can again get that taper started with a couple of angled hammer blows. Bring that piece back to its parent stock width, which will also give you a little extra material long-wise here, which will ultimately be your top and bottom. And a little extra material there is going to be helpful when you get to blending this weld in place. You're ready to taper in your toe, make your 3-sided taper, set your indices. And again, this taper is too steep right now, but don't worry about that. You're going to hit it right on top. Notice how it's lining up with this apex here over a rounded edge so as to not make a shearing plane. Hit it on top, follow this down, drop this hand, allow this curve to happen, and you'll end up with an appropriate shallowness to your taper. So let's watch that happen. Bringing it up off the anvil does preserve the heat. And once you're happy with the thickness, angle that, bring it back to parent stock width on both sides. And now you can bring in those toes, set your indices. You've seen it. It can happen on the edge of the anvil or on a block. And then follow that taper down to make sure it is a pretty shallow angle. You might need to knock in those sides, because remember, we're trying to check that so that when we hit it, it doesn't grow out past the one on the bottom. So there you are. You got your little scarf all ready to go. Now I'm ready to teach you juggling. because really that's all a drop tong weld is. We're moving a little out of our comfort zone here of forging and welding when everything's all nice and tidy together. But instead, we got to line everything up and get it all positioned in time to hit it, in time to weld it. So how do we do that? Both pieces are yellow hot. They've been brushed, fluxed, and reheated. Note that the hammer is ready to go. It's sitting here ready for the smith to grab that easily. And it's even facing the direction that they want it to be. The hammer hand is holding on to the short piece and it's reaching over the anvil with the tongs and anchoring that on the side of the anvil. I've seen people try to line these up like just in the air, and I don't know, it's pretty much impossible. You waste a lot of time fiddling around trying to get those to match up. So anchoring them gives you a stable fulcrum to use to first set this piece down, and you still got your tongs over here. And this, remember, this is your hammer hand over here. Then you've got your material held, your long shaft in your material hand anchored here. You're now able to line that up right so that those two indices match up. The better this fit, the sooner you're welding. If this didn't fit well, your first blow or two is going to be getting those lined up. And when we're forge welding, seconds count. So this might be the other secret of forge welding. Having a good fit saves you time and will get you welding faster. So we've got our pieces lined up. We drop the tongs, pick up the hammer in one movement, hit on top, angle the hammer, follow down that nose or toe of our scarf. Then we're going to flip it over and do the same on the other side. So we've got all our pieces positioned, hit on top. You should see some debris and other nonsense. Ride the flux on out of the middle of that. And then you're going to angle your hammer, follow and blend in this toe. And you can already see some hammer blows impacting the width of this, possibly. So that's why it's good to start thicker or thicken it like we did with this shaft. If you still have welding heat and everything still looks wet, the crust is not encroaching on your welding area, you can turn it over. Notice that the basket handle is now on top. Same maneuver, hit on top, but spend most of your time blending in this toe. As soon as this gets crusty, you need to stop and you need to reheat it. And don't even try to start forging this. Notice that this hammer blow was such that the weld took place at the atomic level down here, a gentle introduction, and your scarves are pretty much intact at this point. That's how it should look when you first stick this. Now, sometimes when you get started doing this, this might have bent out to the side and be a little crooked. Don't worry about that either. If you can get your weld to stick, you can forge it straight again. So I find that I have to heat it at least 3 times before I'm brave enough to start forging. But once your weld is stuck, brush it, flux it right back in the fire, back up to welding temperature, re-stick it both sides, brush it, flux it right back in the fire, and then you can start forging. Forging means I'm just going to blend all this into one cohesive unit. And I'm going to start with hitting in the welding plane or perpendicular to the welding plane, only turning to the side or the shearing plane when I'm really sure of that weld and I still have it at welding temperature. If you move to this maneuver too soon, or you move to it when you've lost your heat, it's going to fall apart. So if that happens, don't worry about it. Just brush it all off and reflex it and try it again, as long as you still have some semblance of a scarf. Once you're done forging, you should have a nicely blended in weld area going from this 1/2 inch to this 3/8 inch at the shaft. So for the juggling, that tong piece is held in the hammer hand. Use the edges of your anvil as that fulcrum so that you're not trying to match it up in the air. That never goes well. And fit it together at the step. Drop your tongs, grab your hammer, weld. So this is executing this for the first time or two. I see this is when folks really ramp up and start to move quickly or a little frenetically. I mean, as I said before, this is only going to cause something else to go wrong. Something's going to fall on the floor, or your piece is going to fall on the floor. I have picked up a piece off the floor and it was still welding temperature and I weld it, but I don't recommend that as a general course of business. So practice this cold. If you practice this cold, you're going to notice how well your pieces are fitting up, and you can correct that before you go to weld. And it's going to give you confidence in your new juggling act, and you'll be able to move calmly and confidently and actually save time that you need to perform this maneuver. So let's watch a little video of that. So hammer hand has the tongs on the far side of the anvil. Line that up on the bottom using the anvil as a fulcrum. Place that on top, hit the top, follow that toe down, turn it over. We still got a great welding heat here. Most of the time is spent trying to blend in that toe. As soon as that crust forms, I want you to reheat it and then continue on with your blending welding. Make sure that you could see Mark here going for his brush. You want to make sure that you brush this thoroughly at this point, because that flux can leave a little hard scale on there that'll be annoying to get off later. So note here, this is just a still of what we just watched, that both pieces are super wet looking. They're the same color. That's how you want it to look. The cooler areas are where you're seeing this crust form. That's your marker. As soon as that crust comes up here, stop what you're doing and reheat. If things didn't go so well, make sure, just think on a couple things. How did your juggling go? Did you anchor both pieces on the edge? Does your scarf fit well? Again, that could be the second most important thing in this weld, other than practicing, that can help you with successful welds. If you have to hit a piece a time or two before they touch, you might have lost your welding heat. Another problem is that they might not have been the same temperature. This weld actually stuck, but then fell apart. And you can see right here, this is not the same temperature as this. It both look a little wet, but they're not the same temperature. That is not going to stick. So make sure both pieces are heated the same color and the same wetness. And it's a nice long heat too. So you have time for this to cool. You might end up seeing this too, where the part that was subjected to this heat sink we call an anvil got a little cold, but everything else around it is still welding temperature. Just give that a second, but you could still be welding this bit that is the right temperature. So all of this was done on a coal forge. Let's look at an option for a propane forge. In a propane forge, scale is your enemy, time is your enemy, even if you do use flux. So an option is to rivet it together and get it positioned together so that you're not having to do the juggling. Now, if you're having trouble juggling, this is also an option for you. There's no problem in doing this. It's just going to take a little more time. You got to drill the holes and set the rivet. Notice that there's no indices because there's no reason we're going to be lining anything up. We're going to be riveting them together. The washer leaves a little stick out on the other side so that you can rivet that other side. So just rivet over this edge, turn it over, rivet over the other edge, and then heat this up to welding temperature. Same steps though, brush, flux, weld, brush, flux, reheat, weld, and then blend in your piece. So let's watch that happen here. So just setting in the rivet, nothing fancy. Turn it around, keep everything in nice alignment, set that rivet on the other side. Notice this is cold, all done cold. It's a 1/8 inch rivet size here, so cold is fine. It'll head over easily. And then it's just a matter of welding per usual and making sure that everything is at a welding heat the same as you work. Brush off all that extra scale, reheat it when you lose your heat, and then just finish off your taper. So I thought it might be fun and recommend for you to do this too. You know, what does that look like? Like, can you tell anything about the rivet? So I tried this in a propane forge, which I don't use a lot. I use coal as my mainstay. Well, and now my induction forge, now that I have one. And so I cut it in half after I welded it. And that's a strong weld. I also tried it with a tack weld just for fun. There was some discussion in my last coaching group about whether or not this was a viable option. And it turns out, in my experiment anyway, that it is. I would just recommend as small as possible. And don't cover up this toe. I still want anything that might have got underneath this weld to ride that flux debris train on out of there when I'm first welding. You can see here's the edges of my weld. Again, that is a nice solid weld. And then I had to try it again in my induction forge with very similar results. And this was a fun experiment with the added benefit of how much scale each of these heating modes produced. The propane had the most, and maybe somebody who's more accustomed to the propane forge can fine tune that so they don't get as much scale as I did, but it was falling off in big chunks. The coal forge was, you know, about what I expect, as that's what I'm used to. And the induction forge was just a little finer, but kind of the same amount. So you are going to lose some to scale. So again, making a case for thickening up that piece before you start to weld them together. But I digress, although I do encourage everyone to do your own experiment. We're ready to turn our piece around. We have a long shaft on the end of our basket handle to be, and we're going to put a collar on the end of that basket. Again, in a propane forge, collar might not be an option for you. You could do a shepherd's hook, and I will show a video on that option. Or maybe you just like that aesthetic better. You could do that as well. We're going to initiate this weld the same way we did the other side, only it's going to be a really short weld. That collar, we're going to be using a 3/4 inch square piece for that. So I need a 1/8 of an inch to stick out, plus my 3/4 of an inch for my weld. So I don't need much of this welded, about a 1/2 inch. I want to turn it round as soon as possible, don't take it. Yeah, so you're going to hit it on the top again like we did. It's a bit of a diamond, but then just take it right to round. If you have a half round bottom swage, 3/4 inch is best, so we don't make this too small. It helps get that rounding happening on all sides, or you can just do this on the anvil. It's a nice to have, not a must have. But do not overforge this. We want to keep that a proud 1/2 inch at this point. So don't overforge that weld. We're now ready to prepare our collar for the weld. We're going to use a 3/8 square bar. And to make a collar, we need to know exactly, like any collar, you need to know exactly how long that collar needs to be. And you also need to understand how that metal's gonna act when we turn it. If we have material that's too long, you're gonna end up with like a happy little ring that maybe you could, wear in your hair or your beard if you wanted to, but it isn't going to be welded to your basket handle because it will have welded to itself. So if it's too long, you're going to end up with a ring. You ever want to make rings? You'll know how to make them. If it's too short, you're going to end up with a thin spot and it won't be evenly collared around your piece. So we really need this to be, Goldilocks just right. So that involves knowing how this metal is going to act and some math. You can do a little bit of math. So first, as just an experiment, if we take a bar and we make it into a circle, you're going to notice a couple things. The first is that this inside had a shorter distance to travel. It has to go somewhere. That metal, it's the same amount of metal all throughout. It has to go somewhere. So it's going to get thicker. This is that inside edge. And it's going to get longer. It's going to stretch. It has to go somewhere. This outside has a longer distance to travel. So it's going to get thin and it's going to retract this edge and you're going to end up with this V. So we have to take our straight bar and prep it a little. No prep, get you the V. But if I take the inside edge and I make it smaller, and I take the outside edge and I make it longer, when I wrap this around, those edges are going to line up nicely. At this point, this is a different distance. When I round it, this edge is going to end up a different edge, different length than this edge. So the middle is the only measurement when you make metal round that stays the same. So that neutral axis becomes really important when we get to measuring, because here the blue is an unprepped bar put in a circle. This added red was a prepped bar made into a circle. And the only part of this bar, this is going to be a longer distance than the original bar. This is going to be a shorter distance than the original bar. The only part of the bar that is the same distance as we started is this middle bit. So when we do our measuring or our formula for figuring out this length, which is essentially the circumference of this circle, we need to measure from the middle. So our circumference is pi times diameter. We know our diameter to be 1/2 in the middle plus half of a 3/8 bar, which 2 halves make a whole, so 3/8. And that gets us a diameter of 7/8 of an inch. Pi, we all know, is, or at least you should know, is 3.14, blah, 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 right? But we're not machinists, we're blacksmiths. So I'm just going to take that by 3, keep it simple. We got 21/8, which breaks down into 2 and 5/8. So my middle to my middle needs to be 2 and 5/8 to get a collar that'll wrap around that 1/2 inch bar that I prepared. I don't know about you, but I can't measure from the middle to the middle on the fly. So I need to figure out another way to measure this so that I know where to cut this off from the main bar. We're going to start with a long bar, taper the end, and mark the one side so we know where it needs to be cut. That means we need to figure out what's this distance right here, this little bit. If I look at that on this graphic, I know that a square is even on all sides, and I want this square right here that forms. That square is going to be half my 3/8, 3/16. So I need to take away 3/16 on both sides. But again, blacksmith, not a machinist, and my guess is that 45-degree angle won't really be 45-degree angles. It'll be more like 60 degrees. So let's get rid of a 16th and just call it an 1/8. So let's take away an 1/8 from each side. So those top edges need to be 2 3/8, and that gets me 2 5/8 along the neutral axis. So we're going to start by just cutting off at an angle the edge of this. And remember, we're going to keep this long bar going, and I'm going to make a mark. I'm not going to cut this. I'm not going to make a deep divot. I'm just going to mark this at my 2 3/8. 1, 2, 3. But I want to show you another option for measuring. Unless you have 3 hands and you can hold the ruler up here and the chisel and hit it all at the same time, this might not be problematic for you, but it's problematic for me. So I'll have another little way of looking at this. And this other option is I've got my neutral axis right here. What if I take this whole bit, this whole box here, and just move it all over so that it lands here? And on my long side, I can still use my original measurement of 2 5/8 because I've just taken this line and I've moved it to here. Hopefully everybody's following that. And now I can set everything on the anvil. I like using a little hook rule flat on the anvil. I can snug this up against it, and I get to mark back to my 2 5/8, marking my short side and my long side to what will ultimately be the same length as that neutral axis. And this hook rule is just, this is just a stainless steel carpenter square that I cut down 1 inch on that. I cut down to 1 inch on that narrow side. So it's getting a little worse for the wear here, but don't use, you make sure if you get a carpenter square that it says stainless on it. I bought one and wasn't careful about that, and a very weird smoke came off of that. I'm assuming it was some kind of galvanizing or something. Don't do that. That's not good for you. All right, so now we've got a mark in place, and we're doing nothing more than marking it at this point. And remember, your short side is your inside. So with the mark down, see the little mark here? We're going to start bending this around the horn, or whatever you have to start moving that around. This isn't forging. There shouldn't be any dings on this. You're always hitting over air. Like, don't hit it over the anvil. You're forging, hit it over air to bend it. And the hammer blows are always going to come at the same spot. And the only way to do that is to drop this material hand lower, 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 lower as you bend this around. I see people, you're starting out straight, right? And then they chase this around till they're practically upside down underneath this, trying to hammer up. Just drop your material hand and that bend will just form around, and you can keep hitting in the same spot. What you don't want to do is bring this over the top of your mark, because now I'm going to continue to cut that through, not all the way. I want to get everything hot. I want my basket handle, this all heated. I want this all heated, and I want to sever this at the very last minute. So cut this to within, a thread of its life here. And now you can heat this whole thing, holding onto that nice long bar instead of fishing around for this tiny little piece. If you're using a propane forge, I suppose you wouldn't have to fish for it, but then we've already talked about how that might not be the best way to weld something. So keep it on the long bar so you can stick it all in the forge and get it hot. Then when it's hot and your basket handle's hot and ready to go, you just wiggle that bit off with some scrolling tongs or some tongs that won't mar your piece and set it on the step. You're going to want this backing here. Place your, all this is hot, remember, place your hot basket handle in the middle and you're going to clamp this around this basket handle by smacking this right here. And once that's clamped all the way around, you're not welding, you're just clamping this to the basket handle. We got our 1/8 stick out so that we can blend that in nicely when we're ready, and leave a little gap here. A little gap is better than no gap because no gap gets you a ring. A ring is not what we want. We want this to weld to the basket handle and then weld to itself. Let's watch all that happen. We're going to start by just starting our angle or our taper at the one end. And we are going to cut this all the way off. Make sure everything stays in check with the parent bar. And now, see, Mark can do all of this at the same time. We're going to make a mark on the top. He went 2 3/8. And we're going to bend this around. Notice how this material hand drops, so his hammer doesn't have to follow that bend around. Bring this so that it's almost severed from the bar, and you can see a little space underneath there still to let you know that you're not quite to the bottom. And then, all right, now we're going to get everything hot. We're heating up our collar and we're just clamping it to the basket handle. So it's not welding temperature, but we really want our basket handle hot or we won't be able to get it hot enough to weld later. So that really needs to be nice and hot. Clamp that around, leaving a little gap at the seam or what will become the seam. Sink that all up nice and tight. And now we are ready to weld this. So to weld, same MO here. Heat, flux, heat, and weld. So hit it on top. The gap should be at either 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock. Hit it on top, turn the gap towards the top, hit it again towards the top till it ends up at 12 o'clock, essentially hitting it 3 times, bang, 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 each time bringing that seam up towards 12 o'clock. And then you could turn it the other way, same thing, hit it on top, bring that seam up towards 12 o'clock, hit it again. And that should get it welded to the handle and to itself. It can be done on the anvil. If you have an 1.5 inch round swage or hardy swage, it will make a little easier going as it'll keep this nice and round as you're beating on it. Our goal is to end up with an end that's nice and smooth like this. So now welding temperature, you're going to hit and blend in that little 1/8 inch stick out to remove all the seam that you see here. When you do this, you're going to hold the handle flat in the swage and your hammer is going to be horizontal, angled. Make sure that the center line of your hammer doesn't get above the top of the swage. If you do that, this is just going to rock this back and forth. You want to hit it where this is secured to either your block or the side of your anvil, which it can be done either way. It's a little easier here. It keeps some of this from jumping around too much, although this will bend, the handle part will bend as you go. Just keep it straight and continue blending sometimes turning it back and forth keeps this from twisting or buckling up too much. And just continue to work this around till you have the surface that you want. And then you can put in facets or whatever you want here. I've also tried this with a longer bar, 3/8 by 3/4, and that does make a nice thicker collar on there. So experiment, again, try different options to see what you like. Notice this is at 3 o'clock to the smith, 9 o'clock to us. Hit it on top. That debris riding that flux wave out. Now it's turned 9 o'clock to the smith, 3 o'clock to us. That's the seam. Hit it on top. Turn that, follow it up, and then just keep turning it around till it's all nice and welded. Blending happens over the edge. It is a little harder over the edge of the anvil, maybe a little easier than a swage, even if it's a wiggly swage. Notice that the center of that hammer is not coming above the top of the swage block. So we're not going to get our propane option, a shepherd's hook. You're going to weld this back farther and then draw that out however long you need it to be to make your shepherd's hook. So weld it back a little further, and then it's just a matter of drawing out that material the usual way. It's always faster to go over two fullered surfaces, so using the horn is helpful. And then this is nothing more than a round taper, curl around the edge, and then make your hook. So this is an option if you prefer that aesthetic, or if you have a propane forge and you're not sure that that collar welding will work, or you tried it and it didn't work. So there you go.
Stay tuned for the final part of the project.